Well, good morning. That was actually a call for action. Good morning. Thank you. It was just a little wake you up here. I'm Dr. Richard Downey, and welcome to the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies. It is such a pleasure to have all of you here with us this morning to address a topic that we all know has tremendous importance, not only for Colombia, for the region. You know, President Juan Manuel Santos started a process that has the potential of negotiations to end nearly 50 years of internal conflict inside Colombia. And there's elements to give great optimism towards that program. But based on the history of other negotiations and the history in Colombia, there's a number of other perspectives regarding how that negotiation process can and will go forward. So we have with us today an absolute superb and distinguished panel to address these issues. And I want to say, first off, we're welcome to all of you. It's very important for us to have this kind of a group here. We have a very distinguished group. We have ambassadors, distinguished senior officials. We have members of the diplomatic community, general and flag officers. All of you are so welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're very pleased to have you here, because what the plan is today is to go through, and I'll turn this over to our moderator, Eric Farnsworth, who is the Vice President of the Council of the Americas, in just a moment to introduce the panel. But the idea is that following this panel presentations of each of our panelists, we'll have a dialogue. So you can really ask all these, and that's what we want. We really want to engage you and engage our panelists in some very straight and direct thoughts here. But this event truly is a collaboration. We are so honored to have with us not only members of Heritage Foundation, the CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies, and also the Council of Americas here with Vice President Eric Farnsworth, with whom all of us have a tremendous collaboration. So would you all please welcome, help me welcome Eric Farnsworth, our moderator for today. Thank you.
Well, Rich, thank you very much. I am really pleased to be joining you all from the kids' table.
It was crowded.
That's a joke, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who can't see over there, I've got a little table over here that I'll be sitting at. Anyway, thanks, Rich, for your kind introduction. I share the sentiments. It is terrific to be here indeed at the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies here at NDU. But before I go into the remarks and introduction of our panel, I do want to thank Rich for the opportunity today, but also indeed for your leadership here of this fine institution. Your voice and those of your colleagues have proven to be among the most astute in regional defense and security issues, and we genuinely appreciate the important work that is done in this institution, has been done, continues to be done, will be done in support of a more peaceful and prosperous hemisphere. I also want to thank Mike Mann and the team here at CHDS for the work to put on the program this morning, and to acknowledge the meaningful role, as Rich did, of sister institutions, including the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Heritage Foundation and others, for their supportive efforts this morning. On behalf of the Americas Society and Council of the Americas, I want to add my welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming to what promises to be a timely and relevant conversation with leading experts on Colombia and the peace process that is currently underway. And I also want to give a special welcome to everyone across the hemisphere who may be tuning in via webcast and watching this from wherever you may be located. Thank you very much for tuning in and joining the conversation as well. This executive forum on the Colombia peace negotiations is on the record, so I want to alert the panelists that anything you say can and will be used against you today. Indeed, this is something that I think will make for a more lively and interesting conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, for more than 50 years, Colombia has suffered from a violent and multi-pronged guerrilla war. Despite numerous efforts over the years, the conflict has repeatedly ebbed and flared, but it has never been resolved. Now, as Colombia seeks to move into its next phase of growth and development, with the support and encouragement of the international community, the conflict remains arguably the most important item of unfinished business left for the Colombian people as they strive to achieve their place in the global economy and the peace and justice that they both long for and deserve. And it is also an opportunity for President Santos and his entire team to cement their place in history to the extent they can find a path toward resolution that is broadly acceptable to all segments of Colombian society. But the path forward is not certain and success is not guaranteed. A year and a half of back and forth discussions and 6 months of secret negotiations in Havana led to a signing of the General Accord that launched the actual negotiations, which are now underway. A ceasefire designed to give space to the negotiators has now expired, however, and the combatants have rejoined the battlefield even as negotiations continue. To complicate matters, at least one of the guarantors of the peace process, Venezuela, is in the midst of a constitutional crisis, and it is unclear how the eventual outcome of that will impact the Colombian negotiations. Assuming the agreement is concluded, the most difficult part, in my view, of the process will begin. And that's the process not of negotiation, but of implementation. And as we've seen from peace processes across the Americas, without effective implementation, even the most ironclad agreement negotiated completely in good faith runs the risk of breakdown and ultimate failure. It is here in particular that the international community can and should be expected to play a meaningful role. Nonetheless, more broadly, Colombia itself is on an upward path and has been for the past decade. The economy is growing, poverty is being reduced, and the middle class is expanding. The country continues to impress observers as a sound destination for investment, with an effective business climate and an improving rule of law. On the security side, the Colombia of today is virtually unrecognizable from where it was a decade ago. Indeed, my first trip to Colombia when I was at the White House in 1995 was to a country that is totally different from the country of today. Despite the picture frequently painted by critics, human rights are respected, violence is dramatically reduced, and promises are being fulfilled. In order to continue on this trajectory, one of the key elements for the construction of lasting peace in Colombia will be to create the jobs required to provide meaningful alternatives for demobilized guerrillas, displaced persons, and affected communities across Colombia. As we saw in Central America coming out of the wars of the 1980s, unless attractive legal alternatives exist, the potential for militants on any side to revert to illegal criminal activities and expanded violence is high. That, along with the easy prevalence of weapons, is one reason why Central America today has become such a security challenge, and indeed continues to be. And that is one of the primary reasons I have been such a long and fervent supporter and promoter of the bilateral trade agreement with the United States that was implemented only last year. In addition to the obvious economic benefits that are already accruing to both the United States and Colombia, the agreement offers a powerful engine for economic growth that will lead to the creation of exactly those sorts of jobs that will be required as the conflict, God willing, concludes. Nonetheless, even though this is perhaps the best moment in a generation, or some would say ever, to think about a final resolution of the conflict, we won't even get to the implementation phase if the parties cannot conclude a peace agreement itself. And that is the challenge that we want to discuss this morning. And we have, as Rich said, a stellar lineup of speakers to do so. It's in that vein, ladies and gentlemen, that I am very pleased and honored to have the opportunity to introduce our first speaker, the Ambassador of Colombia to the United States, Carlos Urrutia. We here in Washington are so fortunate that Colombia has a tradition of sending its very best representatives to the United States, and I've been privileged to work with all of them very closely going back to the early 1990s. And I can say without hesitation that Ambassador Urrutia fits this mold as well. Ladies and gentlemen, you have the ambassador's biography with you this morning, but for those watching on the webcast who may not have the full biography, I would simply say that the ambassador has been a very successful lawyer in Colombia over a 35-year career at the leading law firm of Brigard and Urrutia. He has served in many public and private sector boards and advisory commissions, and I've enjoyed the opportunity to host him here in Washington already since he arrived at the end of last summer, and to meet his wife, Leonore, who is an accomplished designer in her own right. Ambassador Urrutia will offer the government of Colombia's views on the ongoing peace talks, and then he'll be followed by our panelists, whom I will introduce separately after the ambassador has spoken. With this in mind, ladies and gentlemen, let's get to it. Please join me in welcoming to the podium the ambassador of Colombia, Ambassador Carlos Urrutia.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Downey and the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies for this opportunity to speak about the Colombian peace process. As you probably suspect, I venture to say that there is really no other topic for Colombians that that is the subject of more interest, more attention, and perhaps more anxiety, I would say, than the peace process. And for that matter, the prior peace processes that have taken place. As I speak to you today, Colombian negotiators are in La Habana, Cuba, meeting with FARC representatives with the aim of ending Colombia's armed conflict once and for all. As you all know, this is not the first time that we have embarked on such an initiative. In our recent history, there have been many peace processes, but very few peace agreements. Why, then, has President Juan Manuel Santos decided to sit down with FARC guerrillas? And why is it that the government is moderately optimistic that an agreement can be reached this time around? To better understand this whole process and the framework, I'd like to point to past history to better understand how these negotiations are indeed quite different. And allow me a brief trip down history lane. First, there was intra-party political strife, beginning perhaps the immediate past is the so-called 1,000-day war that went on between 1899 and the year 1902. Then there was the so-called La Violencia period from 1948 to 1957, which ended with a peace accord that was launched by then President, our military President, General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla. Both crises ended in power-sharing agreements between the two parties, the liberals and the conservatives. Then came the aftershocks of the Cuban Revolution and the war and the Cold War, and the episode that marked the creation of FARC in 1964 and of the ELN in 1965. And then subsequently, the M19 in 1973. Then the drug trafficking activities found beachhead in Colombia. The Medellin cartel was created. The Cali cartel appeared also in 1980. And FARC went into the drug business in the 1990s and continues to be in the drug business as we speak. The cartels were dismantled and soundly defeated. In 1990, M19 agreed to disarm and entered the political process. Colombian society welcomed it and participated in the drafting of our 1991 Constitution. Today, one of its members is the mayor of Bogota, and many others are part of the mainstream political process. So as Colombia has moved forward, FARC and the ELN remain entrenched in the past. To this date, negotiations with both groups have always been a ploy to widen the scope of their activities and strengthen their political and military hand. And we have the following examples. The negotiations sponsored by the government of President Belisario Betancur from 1982 through 1985 ended in miserable failure and led eventually to the taking of the Justice Palace in 1985, which produced over 100 deaths, including the death of most magistrates of the Supreme Court of Colombia, including all of the magistrates of the so-called criminal chambers of the court, which was in charge of all of the extradition proceedings that were then in course. And then the experience from 1999 through 2002, known as El Caguán, talks that were sponsored then by the government of President Andrés Pastrana. Time, however, is no longer on the side of FARC. It missed a golden opportunity, in my view, in 2002, to achieve a peace agreement with the Pastrana administration at a time when Colombian society would have been ready to be generous in granting them opportunities that are no longer possible. Circumstances today are much different. Colombian society, as well as the international community, no longer tolerate their vicious actions. Concessions that would have been on the table 12 years ago are now simply unthinkable. And why is this so? Well, to begin with, over the last decade, our armed forces have dealt severe blows to the FARC, weakening its structure and diminishing its influence. The once invincible Secretariado is no more. Their ranks have gone from 30,000 men up in arms in 2002 to approximately 8,000 members who are today on the run. The government has regained control of the entire territory. So you may ask, if FARC is really on the road to defeat, why negotiate at this time? Well, President Santos has been clear. If by means of negotiations we can finalize the conflict, spare the blood and suffering of Colombians that would otherwise be in harm's way, and facilitate a future peace, then clearly it is his duty to devote all his efforts to this task. Colombia has changed, as has the world around it, allowing for a real window of opportunity to create a lasting peace. FARC is all too well conscious of this. In this day and age, with the instruments of intelligence and modern weaponry that are available, FARC's prospects going forward are certainly grim. If past mistakes are indicative, they surely understand that this could well be the last opportunity to a negotiated settlement with Colombian society. With this in mind, the government, in strict observance of our laws that set clear guidelines and criteria for peace negotiations, restored contacts with the FARC leadership that had already been made, by the way, by the previous administration. Initial contacts were made over 18 months ago, allowed the government and FARC to agree on exploratory, direct, and confidential conversations that took place in La Habana. Such negotiations lasted 6 months, and from Mr. Enrique Santos, who was a member of the team that negotiated that initial agreement, who was here in Washington and spoke on the subject last week, they met for over 70 times in meetings that many times took over 2 weeks' time. So the purpose of those conversations was to evaluate whether or not appropriate conditions existed to come to terms on a framework to start a formal process. Among other aspects, based upon prior experiences and mistakes, any talks would necessarily have to be confidential and would have to take place outside Colombia. A suitable venue was of course required, one that would enable both parties to have the level of comfort indispensable to focus on the tasks at hand. And it was concluded that the best place to conduct those conversations under the above conditions was La Habana, Cuba. Why did the government think that the right conditions had been reached? Several elements, both having to do with the process, internal, and with the conditions of the process, external, make this process radically different from previous negotiations. I'd like to first point to the external conditions. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, FARC is much weaker than ever before. This time around, it is the strength of the state rather than its weaknesses that brought both sides to the table. A second element derives from the radical changes that have happened over the past decade and that have opened the political spectrum to alternative political views, respectful of the democratic process, especially in Latin America. Today, it is much cheaper, in every sense, to grab power through the ballot rather than by the bullet. The romantic notion of the so-called arms struggle is no longer looked upon with sympathy by the international community or, for that matter, by Colombian society. In this sense, it is worth highlighting that many expressions of Latin American leaders from the left of the political spectrum have directed at the FARC, emphasizing the anachronism of the armed struggle. The international community and Colombian society have no tolerance for FARC's actions. The fact that FARC long ago became involved in the drug trade and that it is widely recognized as a terrorist organization has isolated FARC. Its image and standing have no room for improvement. Second, the internal conditions. Not only have the conditions outside the process changed dramatically, there are major differences, internal differences within the process. This time around, and based on the conversations that both parties had, they were able to subscribe jointly to a common vision and purpose, to end the conflict once and for all, and to conduct discussions based upon an agenda composed of 5 topics. This will ensure that the rules of those conversations will allow the process to be serious, disciplined, and efficient. So why is this any different than past experiences? First and foremost, previous processes with FARC did not have a clear framework to guide the negotiations. This time, the general agreement is a shared path explicitly defining the topics that will be discussed with FARC and setting the limits as to what is and what is not on the table. Second, negotiations will take place without a ceasefire, and there will not be a demilitarized zone, which is probably the worst mistake that was made in the negotiations that took place during the Pastrana administration. Likewise, government policies are off the table. This is not a negotiation to come to terms on matters of policy, whether social policy or policies concerning environmental matters, or, for that matter, policies regarding the position vis-à-vis foreign investment in natural resources. All of those are off the table, and what President Santos has correctly said is He knows well where the red lines are, and he will not go beyond those. Third, this agreement contains a very realistic agenda that includes, as I mentioned before, 5 concrete topics for discussion. The first one being comprehensive rural development. And this, I'd like to point to the fact that the conversations, the negotiations are, at this moment, focusing on rural development and not the old notion of agrarian reform. The idea here is to foster true development in our rural areas. Development that will bring jobs, that will require substantial capital investments as well as technology. And that is simply not doable with the frameworks that we were accustomed to dealing with the notions of what we called agrarian reform. Second, political participation. Third, the idea of ending the conflict. This is the last time, this is the negotiation to end all negotiations on the subject. Illicit drugs is the fourth item. And finally, and very important, victims. This time around, FARC will have to face its victims. FARC will have to agree to repair its victims and will need to be willing to tell the truth. As you well know, Colombian society, as well as the international community, expect victims to be heard and expect that reparation of victims will play a crucial role in any eventual peace process. All of the above will have, of course, implementation mechanisms that will act simultaneously when the final agreement is reached. These mechanisms will have the capacity to execute and implement their mandates and will be made up of representatives from both parties and from society, depending on the case. A third difference that sets this process apart from prior talks is that a clear structure has been defined from the start. There are 3 phases with specific purposes and time assigned to each. The first phase, of course, has already taken place. It involved the exploratory conversations to agree upon the basic framework and agenda for the process. As we all know, it led to the signing of the so-called General Agreement to end the conflict. The second phase, which is currently taking place in Havana, involves the actual negotiations concerning the topics set forth in the agenda. Direct working sessions without intermediaries are occurring between the government and FARC. Although negotiations are happening in Cuba, the parties could well agree in the future to move to a different location. The governments of Cuba and Norway are acting as guarantors, while Chile and Venezuela are accompanying the process. However, both parts may well agree down the road to invite other countries. In this phase, the participation from other interested actors from Colombian society will only happen through the reception of proposals, as was the case with the recent forum on rural development that took place in Bogota last December. The negotiations will be held without interruption until a final agreement has been reached. No new topics can be brought to the table, and the guiding principle here is that nothing is finally agreed unless and until everything has been agreed upon. If, and to the extent that an agreement is arrived at, it will put an end to the conflict. The parties will agree on the most efficient ways to inform about progress being made at the table and to guarantee the required participation from Colombian society, always ensuring the discrete character of these conversations. The third phase will start upon executing the final agreement. Needless to say, The third phase involves implementation of everything that will have been agreed upon, and for this very reason will be the most challenging undertaking that will require putting in place mechanisms such as guarantees and the means to verify that both parties abide by their respective commitments. This is the phase where participation of Colombians will be critical. To prepare for this exercise, I would like to highlight that President Santos is placing strong emphasis on social programs to create the platform for the new Colombia. The government is focused on building a nation with a progressive agenda aimed at ending the deep inequalities and human rights violations that occurred during the conflict. President Santos has many times expressed that his vision is one of an inclusive society that will achieve prosperity for all Colombians, what he has called democratic prosperity. For this, President Santos has gone to significant lengths. I'd like to point to the following policies that place the social agenda front and center in this administration's set of priorities. First, to restore strong and comprehensive state presence in every corner of our country through the so-called consolidation policy. Second, transforming the rural areas and overhauling agrarian production through the rural development policy that will foster economic activity and will create employment opportunities in vast areas that had virtually been abandoned, in part due to FARC's harassments. Third, to implement the processes of victims' reparation and land restitution that were put in place by the Land Restitution and Victims' Reparation Law approved in 2011, with the goal of paying appropriate compensation for past grievances and returning land to the millions of peasants that were displaced from their lots. And fourth, reaching the truth and promoting the rights of victims through the implementation of transitional justice mechanisms. Colombia, ladies and gentlemen, is decisively moving forward on the path to lasting peace and prosperity, firmly supported by a commitment to human rights and security for all. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. I think you've set the terms of discussion of this morning very, very well, so we appreciate that. We appreciate your comments and your presence again here. I should have acknowledged before I started the presence of so many senior folks here in the room, ambassadors and other folks of such importance. Fact is, though, if I started down that path, we'd be here all day because this room is full of important people. So again, thank you for your presence here this morning and for all of you, your interest in the topic. We're going to move to the panel. I'll ask the panelists to actually speak from the table, and I'll ask each of you to, if you can, limit your comments to about 10 minutes. The reason being, as Dr. Downey said, we really do want this to be an interactive session, which will bring in the audience participation, and we want to leave sufficient time for that. Again, you have the biographies of all of the speakers with you. Our first panelist will be Dr. David Spencer, who's a professor here at CHDS, and he's going to assess the position of the FARC. He's going to be followed by Steve Johnson, who heads the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. Steve will be looking at the prospects for a positive outcome for the negotiations. Our third panelist is going to be Dr. Ray Walzer, who specializes in Latin American issues at the Heritage Foundation, and he'll be investigating potential obstacles to the successful conclusion of the negotiations. And then our final panelist will be General Carlos Ospina, who's a former head of the Colombian Armed Forces, and he will be assessing the strategic implications of the peace talks And then, as I understand from the program, we'll have a very short break, and then we'll come back for the Q&A. So listen carefully because we want you to have those good questions ready. Let's start with Dr. Spencer.
Okay, so after that wonderful and very optimistic presentation by the ambassador, I hate to be the glass of cold water. My presentation is basically based on what FARC has said to themselves and what they have said about the negotiations. And you know, I'm not a member of the FARC, but I'm going to try to present their point of view. I think one of the first things to keep in mind is that FARC does not think like Western governments do. They have a very different approach. And although they are normal human beings, subject to normal human frailties, the organization has a number of characteristics that make them an extremely frustrating opponent or to deal with. First, they have a long-term strategic vision, and they have a method to communicate that strategic vision through their conferences. Their conferences are usually about every 5 to 10 years. And this gives very clear strategic guidance that they have not renounced. Second, specific changes or modifications or additions to the strategic guidance from their conferences is communicated through their plenums. And the plenums have not renounced the strategic guidance from the conferences. Their strategic plans often include dates, but those dates are notional. Accomplishing the elements of the strategic plan is more important than the time they do it. And if you look at what FARC has done and has tried to do, it's very clear that they very systematically do what they say that they're going to do. Second, they have a bureaucratic and prolonged education process that all of their leaders must go through, or they cannot become part of the decision-making elite. And what this does, it is imbues the organization with a homogeneous doctrine, with discipline, and an organization that values collective decision-making over individual leadership. So the death of a leader is less important than this broader collective decision-making process. And while there are serious disagreements, which are often played up in the press or in other forums, once a strategic decision is made by the collective, everybody falls in line and obeys those strategic guidelines. And finally, despite setbacks and losses, FARC continues, and it's very clear that they continue to maintain its cohesion, their command and control over all of the organization. So my assessment basically is that FARC has not given up its goal to take power, and what they're trying to do with the negotiations is transform the struggle rather than end it. And it becomes very clear from what they say about the negotiations and the process itself. So why did they agree to negotiate in the first place? FARC recognizes that it needs to regain political legitimacy. They, in a document written by Alfonso Cano in 2008, called the Planned Revolutionary Rebirth of the Masses, they recognize that they have lost significant political space and they need to do a lot to recover that. And if you look at at subsequent plans, they've been very systematic in trying to look for the recovery of this political space. They've done this mostly at the local level and at the international level. And what the peace process does is allow them to regain space at the national level rather than just the local community level. Second, they have a desperate need to play to their own internal audience. Leading up to the peace negotiations, captured FARC computers contained a lot of emails expressing, particularly at the mid-level range, a lot of questions about why they were fighting and why they were sacrificing so much. The peace negotiations help pacify this audience and maintain internal cohesion. One of the messages that the peace process tells them is that their sacrifices have not been in vain, and that the negotiations are a result of the enemy's or the state's inability to defeat the FARC. So in other words, that they have gained a victory by fighting the government to stalemate. A third reason is that FARC has been heavily pressured by their regional sympathizers. In particular, Chavez, Venezuela, Correa from Ecuador, and Morales from Bolivia, and even Castro from Cuba have directly told the FARC that the biggest obstacle to the prosperity of the political left in Colombia is the FARC, and that FARC needs to do something to change that. And so they have a lot of pressure from their outside allies to do this. And so these are the reasons that took them to the negotiations. And I would say a final reason is that whether you are in favor of the current campaign or not, there is no doubt that the continuing losses that the FARC is suffering have been a significant motivator to go to the negotiating table. So the next question we asked is, what does FARC want from the negotiations? What are they looking for? And again, they're very clear. And throughout all of their communiques, throughout all of their comments on the peace process, they have maintained an absolute consistency both with the process itself and with historical approaches of the FARC to negotiations. The basic outlines can be found in two documents that I think are fundamental. One is FARC's announcement of the peace process, and the second is the opening presentation by Ivan Marquez at Oslo. And if you read those two documents, their position becomes very clear, and you can see the consistency of that position being then portrayed in subsequent communiques and discussions. FARC's main purpose of negotiations is not necessarily demobilization, but rather to, in my opinion, to transform the conflict and snatch victory from the jaws of military defeat, turn a military defeat into a political victory. They are consistently and constantly trying to spread the idea that despite all of the Colombian state's investment in military capability, that the Colombian military cannot defeat the FARC. They accuse the military officers in favor of continuing the conflict as searching for the final solution, a very clear allusion to Nazi Germany and the extermination of the Jews, although they admit that they have suffered heavy losses, particularly to Colombian air power. However, they claim, quote, Plan Patriota, their description of the military campaign of the U.S. Southern Command, has been defeated, and the armed confrontation has spread intensely to all of national territory. This is a message they want everybody to know, and they want everybody to know on a regular basis. They maintain that peace is not guerrilla demobilization, but rather transformation of the Colombian state. That's important to notice because what the state defines as end of conflict is not what FARC defines as end of conflict. The state defines end of conflict as demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. The FARC define end of conflict as transformation of society, transformation of the system to a socialist state. Okay? They claim the guns will stop firing when the society is transformed. And let me read a couple of quotes that they say. Peace does not mean the silence of rifles, but rather is the transformation of the state structure and its political, economic, and military methods. And then Alfonso Cano. Demobilization is synonymous with inertia. It is cowardly giving up. It is surrender and betrayal of the popular cause. And finally, in their words, a poorly organized peace can be worse than war. Okay, so their approach to ending the conflict is not the same as the state's approach. Although I agree with the ambassador's presentation, let me tell you what FARC's point of view. FARC does not recognize the democratic advances in Colombia since the Cold War. In fact, they say the one place in Latin America that has not experienced democratic opening is Colombia. They claim that the changes, in other words, that the popularity of the government and the lack of support for FARC's cause are due to state terrorism. Okay, as such, they claim, quote, "We are not the cause of the war, but rather the response to state violence." FARC strongly maintains that they are not victimizers, but rather victims, and that the negotiations should focus on compensating the victims, which include themselves and the population that they claim to represent. They know that the government is not going to willingly transform into a socialist state. Therefore, in all of their communiques, they repeat the same thing. They want to create an informal mechanism of political decision-making. They have called repeatedly on social movements, ranging from labor organizations to lesbian, gay, transgender, and all that kind of stuff, to get out in the streets and protest and create a means of forcing the government to listen to them and make concessions. This is how I believe that they're trying to transform the war. This is a transformation where this form of action becomes more important than violence. Violence will not be abandoned, but violence will move kind of into the background. This is kind of what I call the Bolivian model. They're looking to Bolivia. They're looking to transform the current conflict, which is more of a Cold War conflict based on guerrilla fighting, to more of what the MAS did in Bolivia. They constantly say the following quote: "The sovereignty of the people is the only legitimate authority of the nations." They strongly object to a peace being negotiated between small representatives. They constantly are calling on more broader participation of the Colombian society into the negotiating process, and they see the December 17th through 19th forum on agricultural reform as a huge success for them to open up this negotiation to a much broader agenda, or to line up with their much broader definition of what each of the points that Ambassador Urrutia mentioned is. One of their major complaints is they bitterly complain that they have unequal access to the media. One of their points is that out of the 140 media outlets that have covered certain aspects of the peace negotiations, only 2 have been alternative media outlets. To bypass this, FARC has become very skilled in the use of the internet and other social media over the last few years. I look at those websites all the time. They're very well done. They're very user-friendly, and you can very quickly find very interesting information about what FARC is doing and what they want. And this also, this lack of media coverage is also why they feel that this alternate form of political decision-making through mass action, through mass protest, is necessary. They wish to discredit the government by establishing the perception that FARC is flexible and wants peace, and that the government is only interested in surrender of the organization. They recently published an article about 3 days ago called "The Nose of the Government." They've asked for Simón Trinidad to be freed. The government said no. They asked for a bilateral ceasefire. The government said no. They asked to negotiate the laws of the war. The government said no. They directly communicated with the Minister of Agriculture to explain the agriculture policy. The government said no. They've asked for the common people to be involved in the negotiations. No, et cetera, et cetera. They know that the government's going to say no. The government says no, and then they're able to publish this and say, look, we're the ones that want peace. We're the ones that are offering ceasefires and reconciliation and all this stuff. Look, here it is. And the government has been very consistent in the sense that they said, look, no, we got to stick to our agenda. The 5 points, you guys keep on bringing in this other stuff. But to FARC, their understanding of those 5 points is very different from the government's understanding. I personally think the government has been correct. For example, the issue of the ceasefire. Why does the FARC want a ceasefire? They want a ceasefire because of why they've always wanted a ceasefire, which is to buy time to stop getting attacked. And I'll end with this comment because I know my time's probably up already. the problem is, of course, when the government says no to a ceasefire, then it makes it look like the government is the one that wants war and FARC wants peace. We need to remember that that during the 1999 to 2002 negotiations, when FARC was ascendant, that the government asked for a ceasefire, and it was FARC that refused the ceasefire and said, no, we're going to negotiate in the middle of the war. So it really is kind of your perspective of where you are in the conflict, and and what's going to favor you, whether you're going to offer a ceasefire or not. But FARC desperately wants a ceasefire now because of the losses they're suffering. I could go on. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I'm sure this will provoke lots of questions, particularly since I've thrown water on the whole process. And I will end there. And basically, my assessment is that if I were to predict today what the outcome of the negotiations are going to be, I would say they're going to fail. I think that currently, how the FARC is viewing the peace process and how the government is viewing the peace process are diametrically opposed. And as a consequence, that even though these are the best conditions that have ever existed for peace to happen in Colombia, that the positions are still too far apart, and that there will be more fighting in the next few years. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. I don't know, Steve. That's going to be a tough act to follow. He really brightened the mood here a lot. So give us your sense about some of the opportunities for a successful conclusion to this long-running conundrum.
Well, I'll try to play the role of Dr. Pangloss as much as possible. Best of all possible worlds and best of all possible outcomes. First of all, I just want to apologize a little bit. I got a frog in my throat this morning, and I just haven't been able to get rid of it. But, I think both Ambassador Urruti's comments and also David's are really right on the mark, and we're sort of caught in between wondering where this is going to go. So what does the government of Colombia really get out of this? Well, we know it's been about a 2.5-year project so far since the time that President Santos began some initial forays and talks that led to the framework for these discussions. For many reasons, I'm confident that they will likely continue until the end of next November and will probably be halted as a practical matter by the beginning of the 2014 presidential election campaign. To me, they have two objectives. One, to end Colombia's rural conflict, and two, lay some of the foundation for a durable peace. And they're two different things, very different things in my mind. Given President Santos's high-profile role as President Uribe's defense minister, they risk building up hopes that cannot be achieved. On the other hand, as the army and police continue to advance against the FARC, there could come a time soon when such negotiations might become irrelevant. Unlike the last time the government tried to bargain with the guerrillas from 1999 to 2002, it is negotiating, as both speakers have said, from a position of strength. Now, whether or not the talks are successful, I believe the advantage accrues to the state. Domestically, it is perceived as bending over backwards to give the FARC every chance to participate in making peace, even though it does not have to do so. Externally, it provides a project on which Colombia's erstwhile adversaries may cooperate and find common purpose, thus improving relations with some neighbors and relieving some diplomatic tensions. The only risk is that the administration of Juan Manuel Santos may inadvertently promise too much or bargain something away that will compromise Colombia's democracy or its economy. And hopes are high among the FARC sympathizers and the FARC secretariat itself that the administration will do just that. But I'm betting that it won't. Now, how do peace negotiations work to the government's domestic advantage? Engaging in peace talks makes the state appear attentive to a minority, a small, lingering segment of the rural population that believes in the FARC's socialist principles. And if the FARC does not bargain in good faith and is defeated, then the benefits of public opinion obviously go to the government for having tried. If the FARC does bargain in good faith and agrees to end the conflict, then, again, the benefits of public opinion go mostly to the government, although there would be a bump for the FARC as well. But I think it would be for the FARC's willingness to lay down arms and become a peaceful actor within the current rules of society. Now, what the FARC represented before, an out-of-touch peasant organization that attacks villages, traffics in drugs, and kills, would still be pretty much roundly condemned. And it's a memory that would be very hard to defeat, very hard to forget. This past September, public opinion polls indicated some 80% of respondents favored peace talks, but almost an equal number said that they were against giving the guerrilla any kind of immunity. And after several delays occurred in getting the talks started, a November Ipsos survey happened to find out that those in favor had dropped to about 57%, while 54% said they were pessimistic about the outcome. Moreover, because so much of what is being discussed is kept secret, and obviously for very practical reasons, it's hard to keep the public optimistic. Still, the benefit goes mostly to the government as long as it maintains pressure on the FARC to demobilize either by negotiations or by default through a military defeat. Now, as you all know, the negotiations are focused on 5 areas: ending the conflict, agrarian reform, guarantees for political participation, ending drug trafficking, and reparations to the war victims. Now, if the government handles these issues carefully, it'll come out ahead. The main goal should be to stop violence as the FARC's means of imposing a non-democratic solution. In terms of honoring or establishing a durable peace, land reform could easily usurp discussions of the other points, which would be disastrous as the FARC's redistributive ideas could tie up rural territory, hurt small farmers who lost land as well as big agribusiness, and even foreign investment could be at risk. In this day and age, small farms are not efficient food producers as the FARC believes, and although anyone should be able to own one, they should not be enshrined as the principal agricultural model. Other pillars are easier to manage. Political participation obviously would not be open to those responsible for major crimes, meaning that the top FARC commanders would not be eligible to run for Congress. Ending drug trafficking means cutting off the FARC's income stream. Illegal mining could replace it, but giving up old habits may be hard to do. The FARC will try to find a discreet way to resist this, as David has suggested, but finding few allies among the general public, it may not succeed in this fashion. Making reparations to those injured or killed by the FARC or its landmines will prove painful on both sides, but generally it will work against the FARC. How the peace talks could help the government's relations with close neighbors. This really hasn't been discussed very much yet. It's no secret that the final 2 years of the Uribe administration produced the most spectacular advances against the FARC, but they did so at the cost of thwarting Venezuelan President Hugo Chávez's efforts to play a role in obtaining the release of FARC hostages, and at the cost of normal relations with Ecuador when Colombia successfully attacked the camp of FARC Secretariat member Raúl Reyes in northern Ecuador. By holding the talks in Cuba and providing a role for Venezuelan as well as Chilean diplomats, Colombia is providing an opportunity for the Latin American left to cooperate in ending an era of conflict and providing a democratic survival path for a group with whom leaders in Venezuela, Ecuador, and Cuba have solidarity. Now, this is important, and it's probably a strange thing for somebody like me with my background to be saying. But as you will recall, the United States has been telling Colombia for the last half dozen years that it will be ramping down security assistance and will provide only limited defense support after 2014. Some Colombians believe that close relations with the United States probably hurt negotiations with the FARC back in 1992 to 2002, when it was in the despeje. Conducting talks without U.S. inputs allows friends of the FARC to offer more useful, pragmatic advice. That's a guess on my part. It's not certainly something that I fervently believe in, but it's something that people who are friendly to the FARC are saying. Making amends also lessens the possibility that they will continue to offer overt support to the FARC, or in Venezuela's case, threaten Colombia with some kind of military attack. So it's kind of, in some ways, an insurance policy. Risks the peace negotiations may pose. Colombia's peace talks are not without risk to the government. They could make the FARC appear to be a legitimate political actor, as David has suggested, when it now has most of the characteristics of a criminal band. I kind of think back to Carlos Plotter, who was a FARC defector who came and talked before Congress and even at the Heritage Foundation in 2004. And at that time, he said that he had left the FARC because it was not adhering to its political principles, that it had gone into drug trafficking in a major way, and they were really in business. The FARC could try to make the government assume most of the liability for the atrocities of the war. The easiest way is for it to say that it was simply reacting to the injustices of the time. The government, knowing where red lines are, may inadvertently give away too much in terms of agrarian reform. A December forum sponsored by the United Nations in Colombia on the subject of land tenure generated 500 proposals coming forward, but it also exposed fault lines among special interest groups that could prove divisive. Solutions must be achieved democratically through laws passed in Congress instead of those imposed by a negotiation with a minority that represents less than 1/10,000th of the country's population. Improbable as it may seem, the government could promise too great an amnesty for atrocities in order to entice the FARC to the bargaining into laying down arms. And finally, allowing the FARC to add to the agenda could allow too much time to pass. The bottom line, the government believes that it needs a piece of paper from the FARC saying that the conflict is over. The FARC believes it needs a brand that it can transfer from the campo to the urban political space to launch a movement or party. Neither objective is really within realistic reach, I think, by this coming November. Even if the FARC negotiators were to agree to end the armed conflict, such a position might not be accepted by some or many of the fronts because the terms acceptable to them might not be in place. And the reason that most of these conditions won't be in place is because they require legislative action. And Colombia's Congress won't act without a substantial sign of reform on the guerrillas' part, releasing all hostages, demobilizing child soldiers, and laying down arms. Even if all that were resolved, other problems could remain, such as the fact that many campesinos would support any armed group in certain parts of the country. So to conclude, President Santos came into office very much committed to the same goals as his predecessor, yet it is clear that he is trying to accomplish them heroically, many would say, in a much different manner. Now, the keys to success are keeping very tight control of the peace negotiating process, maintaining military pressure on the rebels to either live by the laws of the land or face total defeat. The overall challenge for the government is to show that it has done due diligence. Whether or not it gets an agreement with the FARC is secondary. The FARC won't do what it is not prepared to do. But the government can and should get credit for defending the interests of the majority of law-abiding Colombians. Thank you.
Steve, thanks very much for those perceptive comments as well. Before we go to Ray, let me just ask you, one thing you didn't raise in the context of some of the incentives for peace, let's put it that way, or drivers toward peace, maybe is a better way to put it, is the idea that FARC maybe just be tired, right? They've been in the field for a long time. The leadership has changed, but a lot of the folks have been in the field for a long time. One of the things we saw in Central America, Guatemala in particular, was the aging of the senior directorate and the assessment that, in fact, they just wanted to retire, right? And it's some of the things, and you brought in, I think, very perceptively some of the international partners, Cuba being one of them. Cuba has a leadership that, you know, despite all odds, is going to have to pass along at some point, right? Maybe. But the point being, in all seriousness, you know, how would you assess that factor in terms of contributing to the idea that peace could be at hand, obviously recognizing all the other obstacles that have been raised? Is that a factor, or is that something that in this particular instance really doesn't hold much water?
my sense is that there are some in the FARC that have lived outside, like Ivan Marquez for 7 years in Venezuela, who have maybe a different point of view that might be a little bit more, in some ways, enlightened, even though he's one of the most radical elements. But at the same time, you've got front commanders that have been in the jungles for all of their career and really are out of touch. They don't know what the rest of Colombia looks like. They aren't familiar with the way people lead their lives in urban areas, things of that nature. And the temptation for them to change their way of life and to do something very different, which would mean demobilizing, leaving combat, not being in charge of something, I think would be very minimal. I think the incentives would be very reduced compared to the fears of what lies ahead in going into that kind of brave new world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks for those comments. Dr. Ray Walzer, please.
Eric, thank you very much. I thought that the previous speakers would leave me a little space to talk about obstacles to peace, but they've pretty well stolen much of the thunder, and I keep sort of scratching off things that have been touched upon, particularly by David Spencer and his excellent look inside the FARC, and secondly, in Steve Johnson's also well-placed piece on obstacles to peace. I'll make a few observations. I know time is running along, so I will try to keep very brief. First of all, I think we have two clashing paradigms that are at work in Colombia, and the tensions are still very palpable between the two of those paradigms. I think the first paradigm is clearly that the FARC, the current insurgency, is a narco-terrorist organization that lacks political legitimacy and is really outside the orbit of a democratic conversation. I agree that David Spencer's, they're an organization with a long-term strategic plan based on their sort of Marxist-Leninist fundamentals, which means the goal is the seizure of power. The tactics that they're employing, obviously evolving, but that seizure of power is still the objective. And the assumption of many Colombians is, to quote the Mr. Wayne LaPierre, that the only thing that stands between bad guys with guns are good guys with guns. And I think there is a perception that the armed forces, the Colombian state, are really the guarantors of peace, and that really negotiations at this particular point represent what usually is referred to as the triumph of hope over experience. So that's one paradigm. I think the ambassador has very carefully laid out a very different paradigm, one that which, for whatever you think of the FARC, that the circumstances have changed, the correlation of forces has altered, that an end of conflict is indeed possible, that an appropriate mix of state power, reform, and attention to the underlying factors that have driven the conflict in Colombia may hold out the chance of what President Santos called a guerrilla-free Colombia. He wrote a very nice editorial a couple of months ago that was published, and lay the foundations of a stable and lasting peace. But I think these two paradigms, which have been captured in are still very much clashing at this particular point, and I don't think, from an external observation point of view, that we can say one predominates over the other. So what are the sorts of obstacles? Clearly, people have touched upon public opinion. Colombian public opinion supports the concept of a negotiated end to the peace, but then when you, as Steve and others have mentioned, when you dig down, do they talk that they favor FARC participation in politics? So I think public opinion is a major obstacle and will continue to be a challenge. I think that the FARC positions have been touched upon very much by David Spencer. I think that another obstacle that what the literature that I've read, is that the FARC is not as monolithic as it likes people to believe that clearly that there are various elements which David touched upon between sort of those who have lived outside the country, sort of basically military, sort of true believers who have followed the sort of the ideological lines, and the criminal elements. I think that one study that was published last October, for example, claimed that something like 15 of the 67 fronts sort of followed the lead directorate of the Secretariat. So there's going to be a lot of rogue elements that are out there too. So, and clearly the mindset, again, is, if in reading all the documents, very much a Marxist, class-based, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-U.S. mindset that is not going to be easy to change. And their views range from the sort of from the utopian to the romantic. In some respects, their picture, as Steve mentioned, sounds like they want to sort of create Jeffersonian agrarians out there in the rural space of Colombia. I mean, it really is hard to fathom how you're going to create in this sort of in a modern context the sort of rural development community that they want. And besides that, they want to take about 20% of Colombia's land and redistribute it. And the last sort of figure, I think, on the chopping block under the victims law was something like 2 million hectares. The FARC is talking about 25 million hectares. And when you start redistributing that sorts of they've moved from what we call restitution to redistribution, which, if you represent the Heritage Foundation, doesn't sit very well. Clearly, we have a number of challenges in the legal and juridical area. Colombia has great experience in demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. It's clearly been one of the great success stories. The reintegration of the paramilitaries, despite the presence of the BACRIM, the numbers of FARC who have gone down, who have basically demobilized. I mean, it is a story probably we don't pay a great deal of attention to. But how is this process going to work? This whole issue of impunity. Clearly, my understanding is, I'm not a legal expert, that elements within the most recent law, the law of June 2012, could open the door for amnesty for virtually any member of the FARC, regardless of their crimes. Again, I'm not going to go that, but the impunity issue, I think, is going to be obviously very, very critical. Where do you go on drugs, coca production? I've seen some of the positions talk about sort of a Bolivian approach, why you want to sort of honor the coca crop and look at it for its sort of its intrinsic sort of values, is obviously for coca consumption, the chewing of the coca leaf, to using it for non-drug sort of ends. So you've got a whole coca conversation that they want to introduce. And what do you do with the monies? I mean, what exactly has the FARC done with the money? It's it's garnered from from decades of involvement in drug trafficking. What are you going to do with the illicit wealth and the like? Political participation, I think, has been very much touched upon. How do you integrate the FARC? The levels of mistrust are obviously extremely high. Moving away from the FARC, you have obviously scarcity of time. The clock is ticking, and people seem to say that November is kind of the drop-dead date for some sort of outcome. Here we are. We've come roughly 4 months. This is the middle of February. The clock is ticking. And it's very interesting that we have had the conversation, and I get to be the first one who mentions, I believe, Alvaro Uribe. I think there are domestic political forces at play which will also present certain obstacles to a solution. Clearly, there is a very powerful political actor, one who has appeared here on numerous occasions, who very much feels, sort of adheres to paradigm number one, which I mentioned, who has 1.7 million Twitter followers, and continues to express a very deep skepticism about the prospects for negotiations. The role of the media, the role of the military, what's going to be the military, particularly if they see that somehow or another military officers and soldiers are being prosecuted for criminal acts, and members of the FARC are seen to have given sort of either dealt with lightly or left at liberty. That's going to be a major sort of challenge. And of course, economic interest. As one commentator said, when peace comes, a lot of people will have to be taking a pay cut. So there are very strong vested economic interests that are going to be touched by by a possible peace agreement. So those are sort of the obstacles. Not saying it can't be done, but they're clearly out there. Two final comments. External players. I like to think of Havana as the place where revolutions go to die. We have the Castro brothers, who are not exactly fit and fiddle these days, and a revolution that is having trouble finding its way, certainly can't find the next successor generation. We have Hugo Chavez, who has not been seen for the past 2 months in any public, but we hear that he is doing well, he's recovering nicely. There is a connectivity between these three events. We don't know. We're not privy to the sorts of things that go when they leave the negotiating table, when they go and hang, when they go and hang with with the Cubans, when they go and hang with the Venezuelans. I think that there is this tendency of the external players to play down the armed seizure of power. And I agree that the idea the ambassador talked about, it is time to move to the ballot box. They want to get the FARC to the ballot box. But on the other hand, they want to sort of begin to come up with a plan that would replicate a very strong authoritarian leftist populist model sort of the Bolivarian nature. I'm not conspiratorial minded, but I do think that there is a considerable amount of collusion between the forces of the radical left, the anti-American, anti-imperial left, that continue on the sidelines in Havana. How those will play out. Final factor is, I'm not sure exactly where the U.S. is headed. As Steve pointed out, the U.S. has clearly endorsed the talks, but we're looking at obviously continued reductions. This would be a time, obviously, to step up if we were the U.S. and provide assistance to help carry out those sorts of peaceful transitions, but that does not appear likely. We've got whole issues about, in this country, we're now sort of trying to sort out whether or not it's a good idea to legalize marijuana. We don't have a very clear drug policy. We have a White House that has not been overly engaged in Latin America, and I kind of doubt that Secretary of State Kerry will show any new enthusiasm. In fact, he's apparently made some statements about, on the record at least, I saw in Colombia reports, on the legitimacy of the FARC's social grievances. So it's going to be kind of hard to figure out exactly where the U.S. is going. We support the peace process in general, but where will we be when Colombia, should they sign an agreement, where will we be to back up and support that process? So I think there's a lot of obstacles. I too hope that hope will triumph. My final comment was that I stood last time I was in Bogota in April of last year, and I stood where Jorge Elizar Gaitan was gunned down, and I looked around, and Bogota was prospering and doing well, and it certainly was not. It had come a long way from the Bogotazo. So I think that Colombia can move forward. But I'm not sure that this particular vehicle, these peace talks at this particular time, like some of our other colleagues, will be able to overcome the many obstacles that stand in their way.
Ray, thank you for your comments. And in fact, you despite saying at the beginning that everybody stole your thunder, you introduced some very important points into the conversation, so congratulations on that, not the least of which was Colombia's own domestic politics. I mean, that's a really important point. every country has domestic politics, and you highlighted that, and I think that was very appropriate. And you also raised the question about what will be the role of the United States, and I hope that that's something that we can explore a little bit in the question and answer period, because that is clearly an important point which is kind of out there that we really haven't discussed. General Ospina, you will be the final panelist in this introductory session, so we give you the opportunity now for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. But I have to admit that I'm a little disappointed, because when you are the last panelist, they always say, last but not least. But seems that I'm only last. After these excellent presentations, I will try to address these subjects from a strategic viewpoint. So I'm going to talk about strategy. And strategy sometimes is too boring. So before jumping into the strategic field, let me set my personal position about this issue, that it's in accordance with the opinion of the majority of the Colombians in the streets of Bogota, of Medellin, and in the rural parts, in the countryside. Some of these points have been addressed by Ambassador Urrutia when he talked about the red lines. But anyway, let me throw them. First of all, negotiating with terrorists is not a healthy practice. However, we have to admit that it has worked in other parts of the world, like in Central America, like in Nepal, and in other countries. So maybe it's not healthy, but could be useful. But in the second place, if the peace process means impunity for the FARC leaders and free way to their participation in the political life as main actors, I will have to oppose strongly the peace process. Justice has to be served, and guilty terrorists have to pay for the crimes. And by the way, they are by thousands. Peace cannot be obtained at all costs. If the peace process means negotiating the structure of the state, or the constitution, or the laws, or even minor regulations, I will declare myself opposed to this process. In this case, democracy, that's to say, the will of the average Colombian, will be meaningless in front of the power of the criminals. Personally, I think that the FARC understands the issue of time that has been addressed by Ray, and they will take advantage of this issue to the last day. And finally, the goal of the FARC will never change. They will always try to seize power, one way or the other. Okay, let's jump into strategy. That was personal and emotional, I think. But let's jump into the strategic implications. I have three basic premises. First of all, from now on, military operations will have a much more political value. In the second place, public opinion will judge the peace process according to the level of local security. If you feel that there's no local security in your village, in your city, in your neighborhood, you will go against the peace process because you will feel that there's no security. And in third place, strategic communication will be the key element for shaping the environment, the way the government and the FARC communicate with the people will be key from now on. The way they will launch their messages to the Colombian population will be key. With these premises, I have analyzed 4 variables. These variables have been addressed already in the government side by Ambassador Urrutia. So I will concentrate in the FARC. First of all, political objective. The FARC political objective has always been to seize power through armed struggle. However, the strategic plan that they have designed has never worked. The FARC has aimed at 3 variables to achieve this plan. First of all, people's mobilization. Second, neutralization of the Colombian military. And third, strengthening of the organization lately through drug trafficking. Not the first one has worked. People has never massively support the FARC. Yes, they get some local support, but not a massive support from the Colombians. So the first of the variables has absolutely failed. There's no mobilization. There's no people mobilization. In the second place, they have never been able of neutralizing or demoralizing the Colombian military. In spite that some years ago we have some severe defeats, the Colombian military has never lost the morale. So this political objective through this viewpoint has failed. So through the peace process, the FARC is aiming to another political objective, and this is to obtain legitimacy as a first step to obtain belligerence status. And that's why they have used strategic communication to launch an aggressive campaign aimed internally and externally to clean their image through several announcements. First of all, they declare that they will not kidnap any more people in Colombia. In the second place, they order to their fronts and to their people a unilateral ceasefire. In the third place, they claim that they have no links with drug trafficking. Then they order the release of the hostages taken in the last week. Last week, in spite of this announcement of the end of the kidnapping in Colombia, they took some policemen and some soldiers, but now they have announced that they will release these people. And of course, they'll continue to ask for a bilateral truce with the government, of course, to protect the population while conversations take place. So if you see, that's a very, very smart campaign, communications campaign, and it's trying to help their image internally and externally, because we have to admit that it's a very, very smart movement. In the second place, they have ordered dispersed and frequent attacks on soft targets around Colombia to impress as an efficient and mobile guerrilla and to force the government to accept the bilateral ceasefire as they are claiming. So with this in mind, we can say that they have a new political objective, But this political objective is only a means to an end, and the end is to seize political power. One way, through political ways, or the other, through armed struggle with another characteristics. So I'm going to discuss about those characteristics in the second variable, that it's lines of operations. Lines of operations, as you know, are the ways that are used to obtain an objective. They can utilize different approaches and different means, but basically they follow the fields of power, that is political, economical, social, and military lines of operation. Traditionally, the FARC has always privileged the military lines of operation over the other lines. In fact, after the adoption of drug trafficking as main means of financing, they purchased weaponry, they purchased equipment, and they concentrated in military operations combined with terrorism and other violent actions. They have targeted military and civilian targets, and they have aimed to destroy their will, and to create fear, despair, and anguish. It's like as an example of this is the armored strike that's currently is taking place in the department of Chocó, in the border with Venezuela. They have ordered everybody. I mean, they have ordered to stop productive activities and public transportation in that department under death threat. So the department right now is paralyzed. That's part of the new line of operation. But of course, now they will reinforce that line of operations with political activity, traditionally neglected by the FARC. And that's the reason they have been unable to mobilize people. That's why I claim that the peace process has had serious implications of the FARC strategic lines of operations. Now they understand that the military is only one of them, and that procedures like the war of movement are only circumstances that in a given moment can turn against them, as in fact happened some years ago. Now they understand that they need a much more political approach. And that's why they have enhanced the importance of popular organizations and the contact with the masses. And of course, coordination with political movements. And that's why I think that the peace process has impacted in a very dramatic way the FARC lines of operations. And this contact with the political movements can take us to a question. Are they preparing to become a political party, or are they preparing a better military campaign? The third variable is sustainability. During many years, the FARC has used widely and with no restriction money coming from drug trafficking. This is not a secret. And in spite of the efforts of the FARC negotiators to try to deny it, everybody knows. However, as a consequence of the peace process, they understand that in the future, this is going to be very difficult. Because with this practice, they will lose legitimacy, and of course, their future might be compromised. It's possible that they will try to use other means coming from investments. In fact, they are doing already this kind of finances that they have already prepared after washing the drug traffic money and using it in legal industries and business, according with the guidance given by the 7th and 8th Guerrilla Conferences. It also includes other very profitable activities like mining. Even it's possible that during the peace process they might do a spectacular announcement like collaboration against drug traffickers in their areas or something like that. Another possible course of action could be the idea of splinter groups from the FARC, but secretly providing the organization with funds coming from drug trafficking. Anyway, they have understood that drug trafficking is not an option for the future. And the last variable, impact over the population, I have analyzed it in two ways. First of all, credibility. At the beginning, the peace process had a strong support from people, as I said before, in the streets, in the rural areas, in the villages, because everybody had hope in the peace process. But as it has developed, part of the population is beginning to have second thoughts. First of all, they see some patterns as in the Caguán. That's the previous process with President Pastrana. And second, and very important, they feel that local security each time is more and more affected by the attacks of the FARC. This week we have had a lot of assassination. 2 days ago they attacked a village in the department of Huila. And this type of attack had been eradicated some years ago. And that's why in the credibility of the peace process is beginning to erode. So I think in the second place that some action has to be taken to protect the population, the people. There's a plan, I'm sure you already know, it's called Espada de Honor. I think should be revised and especially address what it's related with local security, not with the use of technology to gun down bad guys, but I would say in the part of local security. Well, these are my strategic analysis of these 4 variables. I won't talk about the government because Mr. Ambassador has already done it, and I will end here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. General Ospina. Very, very good comments. Dr. Ospina, too. But the fact is, I think, ladies and gentlemen, we've been treated to one of the more comprehensive conversations of the guerrilla conflict, certainly that I've heard in a long time, and I trust that you have, too. It's really laid the groundwork for an outstanding conversation to follow. I hesitate to do this because it's going to break the momentum of the conversation, but because you all have been so patient, and you probably need to check your BlackBerries, we are going to take a quick break. I'm going to hold it right at 10 minutes because we've still got a lot to cover, and we want to get into it. Please be back here. We'll start in 10 minutes. Thanks very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's reconvene. And again, for those tuning in via webcast, thank you for staying with us. We'll be going for another 30 minutes or so. And for all of you who came back from the break, indeed, thank you for doing so. It's always a challenge when you run a break like this. Sometimes you lose some of the audience. So I was reluctant to do that, Rich, but in the interest of civility, we thought it was necessary. But we have the opportunity now to investigate and explore some of these ideas in greater depth. There is great expertise in the room, and I'm not being solicitous, I'm being honest. There is great expertise among all of you on these issues. Many of you have practiced in the region for years in civilian or military capacities. And so undoubtedly you have not just questions, but perhaps interesting insights as well. And so we would encourage those to the extent that you keep your interventions as short as possible so that we can cover as many topics as possible. What I'd like to do is I'd like to invite 2 or 3 questions at once, and then we'll send them to the panel for each of the panelists to consider. Panelists, I've just given a request to the audience that they keep their comments as short as possible. I would actually do the same request for all of you, that in your responses you also keep your responses as short as possible, meaningful but short, therefore to allow us to get as many questions and answers as possible. Well, let's open it up to all of you, as I promised we would. So now we have the opportunity. If the question is designed for one specific panelist, feel free to call on that person or to direct it to that person. And please identify yourself by name and organization. We'll start in the back corner, please. Do we have circulating microphones by any chance? There's microphones on the desk, or if you just want to shout. Right.
Okay. My question is the following. Obviously, the Venezuela and Cuba coach the FARC on what they need to do to obtain the best concessions possible from the government. That's their job, is coaching. What European country also acts in a coaching capacity for the FARC to try to give it advantage over the government?
Thanks very much. Very specific question. Are there other questions? Also in the back on the other side of the room, please. Can you use the microphone? And the reason why I'm insisting on that is because we have people tuning in from remote. They can't hear you unless you use the microphone.
Aaron Thompson, Department of State. I have 2 related questions. My first question is for Dr. Spencer, but anyone can address it. You said that the FARC's objective of the transformation of the conflict into a political conflict was diametrically opposed with the Colombian government's objectives. But isn't the Colombian government also looking to transform this conflict into the political realm? And also, many have said that the FARC's objective is gaining political power, like Morales did in Bolivia. But it appears that the far left in Colombia is very ineffective, as we've seen with the failure of the Polo Democrático Alternativo and the difficulties that Gustavo Petros faced in Bogota. And the FARC has a 5% approval rating or something around that. So how likely is it that if this conflict becomes political, that the FARC will be able to gain any sense of political power in Colombia?
Very good. Thank you for your questions, and we'll go right here, please.
Vicente Chandia with the Embassy of Colombia, and this is a question maybe for David and General
Can you put the microphone a little bit closer to you, please? There you go. Thank you.
This is a question perhaps for David and General Ospina and maybe Ray as well. You all mentioned that this is changing the scenario for FARC, the peace negotiations. But for all you mentioned, things haven't changed that much. I mean, David, you mentioned that that the negotiation maybe opens up some media space for them, but you also said that the FARC complained that they don't have the media. General Ospina mentioned the strategy by which the FARC would be trying to change their view, the way they are viewed by releasing hostages. But that's been happening ever since the government of President Uribe. So the strategy is not new. It's always been there. So what's changed really for the FARC? I mean, what has really changed for the FARC with the negotiations that was not there before?
I think these are four very perceptive questions from 3 questioners. Let's take the first one first. Let's take them in the order that they came in. And the question of Europe. What's been the European role in this? And has it been an effective role, a healthy role? Who wants to take that one first? I can call on names, but if anybody has a particular insight into that, feel free. Don't be shy.
Just as, again, a casual observer, and I'm sure the ambassador or others probably have greater insights, I'd say that the European has not, other than, of course, the Norwegians offering their sort of mediating role. I would think that from the FARC standpoint, that their turn to their sort of solidarity networks and the Bolivarian network to help to legitimate their position. And always has been the question of the role of the NGOs, particularly the more pro-left-leaning sorts of NGOs. So I think that officially governments are probably at a distance, wishing and supporting the government's process, that solidarity networks within Europe and throughout Latin America. I mean, we still clearly have the Solidarity Support Network. We have the Foro de Sao Paulo and the other sorts of groups that support or at least coaching and providing assistance in the political agenda aspect of this peace process.
I mean, beyond actual coaching in the negotiations, is it realistic? And this is a question. I mean, I'm not trying to lead to a particular answer because I don't know. Is it realistic to think that the Europeans will take a meaningful role in terms of implementation of the accords? I mean, we saw what happened in the origination of Plan Colombia, which was designed by the Colombian government to bring in the support of the United States, but also Europe. And the United States, at the end of the day, I think was very supportive, and Europe wasn't. What is this? Have circumstances changed along those lines so that we could think of Europe, either individual countries or perhaps the EU, as an entity being supportive of implementation? Does anybody have a particular sense of that? Well, we'll take that under advice. We'll take that one for the record, ladies and gentlemen, for the next congressional hearing that any of you may be involved with. Anyway, it's an interesting point that's occupied my mind somewhat in terms of what support can we really think in terms of assisting the parties in the implementation phase. Well, let's go to Dr. Spencer. You've got a couple questions before you, so let's get to those.
Okay, and probably General Spina would also comment on these as well, since he and I did not coordinate before this meeting, but we basically said the same thing. He in a much more elegant way than I did, but. Of course, both the government also wants to transform the conflict from a military conflict to a political conflict, but that's not necessarily that's not necessarily what the FARC thinks of in terms of transformation. The FARC is not interested in demobilization, and they're not interested in abandoning violence. What they're interested in is broadening their methodology to include both legal political activity as well as what I would call illegal or semi-legal political activity. So a combination of mass action, marches, protests, road blocking, all the types of things that we saw in Bolivia, which were, if you study it, accompanied by violence. But the violence was in the background. The violence was a complement, was more part of messaging. There was always kind of a latent threat of violence if concessions weren't made, and it was reinforced by selective assassination and ambushes and mines and sniping and all kinds of stuff. And the government was forced to either I go to war or I make concessions, and so they made concessions. This is what the FARC, I believe, has in mind. Never totally abandoning violence, but perhaps pushing it to a secondary position. And General Spina said, and I agree, the violence in Bolivia was about protecting their economic income, was about protecting the income for the cocaleros in particular from drug trafficking, and that was used to then finance the illegal and the semi-legal political action, as well as to create a crisis, and then to fund the legal political action, which basically offered to solve the crisis through elections of their own making. And this is the model that FARC is looking at, not what we would think of as transforming into a legally established political party and participating in normal politics and being elected to either the legislative or the executive positions of Colombian government and operating within the norms of what we would call normal politics. And so it's a very different approach and a very different thought process about the transformation of the conflict. What are their chances? Well, and I think this also goes a bit to Vicente's question, the chances right now are probably null. But FARC doesn't think about now. They think about long term. So they're not thinking about today or tomorrow or next year or 5 years from now. They're thinking 10, 15, 20 years from now. And so they're establishing the precedent, the basis on which they will build this activity. And again, I don't think that Colombia's situation is exactly like Bolivia's, but I think if you look at the Bolivian Cocalero movement and where it started and where it ended up, the process took about 25, 30 years. And FARC has that type of vision, and they have that type of discipline. I think it's very hard for us in the West to comprehend how these organizations work and the discipline that they have. This is very much the old, Bolshevik communist model that has been adapted to modern times, and this is where they're going. I mean, they've stated very openly in their documentation. So their transformation is not our definition of transformation, and I think that's very important to keep in mind as you look at both the peace process itself and the agreements that are from the peace process, and how FARC defines what those agreements mean and how the government defines what they mean, because we can think we think in 4-year increments. Maybe in Colombia, I think they also have 4-year presidential terms. We look at what we're accomplishing in 4 years. They're looking at what we're going to accomplish in 25, 30 years. And I don't know if that answers both. So what is different now is that, for example, since 2008, FARC have been working on local politics. So there have been a lot of local manifestations, and they've also worked heavily. They have their international commission is mentioned quite a bit in their documents, and so they've been doing a lot of stuff like creating web pages and accessing supporters from their European network, which I think are largely relevant, which is why I didn't answer the question. But they're relevant in the sense that they can point to say, hey, we have support in Norway, we have support in Sweden, we have support in whatever. Well, they're 10, 15 people, but still the message is more important than the actual impact of that relationship. And so now they're looking at the national audience. Notice that their call for mass action is not support the FARC, it is support the peace process. So they're calling for all the people that kind of have a different view of the peace process to gather together and march and protest, against the government's point of view. And over time, that then becomes the coalition led by the FARC to accomplish something else. And so what they're really attempting to do is lay the foundation to then, over time, accomplish a much bigger political objective. And I think that's what's different.
Do others on the panel have views along those about those questions? General, please.
I think the two questions might merge, Vicente's and State. But if you want to understand these insurgent organizations, you have to know about the models, because they don't improvise. The FARC is not a bunch of guys running up and down and searching for something to do, or just to plant a bomb or to kill a person. They have a very, very serious strategic plan that they don't abandon, so they might modify the plan. There are several types of plans. For example, we have the Vietnamese approach, the Chinese approach, and I would also mention the Nicaraguan approach. So the goal of a strategic plan is to create social and political conditions to open a space for the insurgent organization. And that means that they use two types of activities, military and political activities. If you go back to Vietnam, you will see that they use mainly force. They try to use force as a main means until that violent approach open enough space for the political action. If you go back to the Chinese, you will see that this protracted plan, strategic plan, Mao's plan, was to use time and guerrilla action, growing guerrilla action, to open the space for the political action. The Nicaraguan plan was different. The Sandinistas, they used a different approach because they used more political action and then armed action. But in fact, what it caused the collapse of the government in Nicaragua was the amount of political action, coalitions, coordination between the political, let's say, the political branch of the Sandinistas and other political organizations, popular organizations. So in my view, what the FARC is moving is trying to shift from a Vietnamese approach that in fact they used during the 80s and 90s to a more Nicaraguan approach with much more political, much more coordination with political sectors, and using violence, but in less degree. As I mentioned in my presentation, attacking soft targets just to create an impression, but actually the main action is a political action among the society. So in this way, they began to create the conditions, the social and political conditions to seize power.
Let's take another round. We'll start here.
Arturo Contreras. I want to put attention in the concept of Dr. Spencer about the transformation of the war in Colombia, because since 2001 we have indication that the Bolivarian movement, and concretely the FARC, are changing the concept of war to an unrestricted warfare, and that is particularly clear. And the political process in Colombia and the current process of peace is presenting us different timings. And my question is for the ambassador and for the rest of the panelists: how the timing, the political timing, the judicial timing, the legislative timing will help to create the successful conditions that are required to be effective in this political peace process. Because the social timings and the timing of the FARC are not in coincidence with the timing of the states, of the different level of states, from a strategical point of view, judicial point of view, and legislative point of view.
I think it's a very perceptive question and very relevant question. Thank you for raising it. We will come here to Phil McLean.
Phil McLean, Association Clean CSIS. The question is the practical result. Okay, we're on. Of the practical outcome of these negotiations with regard to Colombia as a whole. I mean, the peace negotiations are enormously important, but they are only a part, and maybe a decreasing part, of the Colombian reality. Colombia is growing. It's becoming a more important commercial world, even a world factor. And the question is, what perhaps the ambassador and maybe the others have some comment. What do you hope for is going to come out of this? I take a look particularly at the budget implications. Colombia is, I understand, in the middle of a tax reform. The wealth tax, which has carried the the growth of the military is not anticipated to go on in the future. That the consolidation plan that you spoke of is obviously going to be very expensive, and in fact, in contrast to what we saw 2 years ago, clearly consolidation is taking a back seat at the present time to other aspects of peace negotiations. So my question is, what's the practical? What does the government look forward to as the positive outcome of this thing in terms of the distribution of national goods?
Very good. Thanks, Phil. I think I saw Mark Rondon had a question back there, too. So this will be the last one. I think probably we'll have time for just this round, and then we'll have to wrap up. So we'll give everybody on the panel a chance to weigh in to the extent you would like to. Mark.
So as Eric said, I'm Mark Rondon. I'm with the U.S. Defense Department's Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats Office. My question is principally for Ambassador Urrutia, but others may want to weigh in. Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned that one of the formal topics of the negotiations is the drug industry. And insofar as you're able to share your government's negotiating strategy in public, how would your government see being able to negotiate with an insurgent force on an industry that's inherently illegal, clandestine, lucrative? I mean, several of the panelists have talked about how the FARC depends on the drug industry and other crimes like kidnapping. And so my question is, assuming that there's some possibility that these negotiations could prosper and could result in something approximating peace, how would a government and an insurgent organization actually negotiate successfully on a clandestine, illegal industry? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, I think all three questions were directed at least in part to you, so we're going to give you the opportunity to respond as you see fit. We have the first question about the timing of the negotiations and how that's contributing to the success.
I don't take notes as fast.
All right. So how is the time frame of the negotiations consistent with the internal time frames, perhaps, of legislative elections, presidential elections, various social activities in Colombia, or are they divergent? The second question is in terms of where do the peace negotiations fit into Colombia as a whole? Is it an important but diminishing aspect? How is it fitting into the modern Colombia, and what's the Colombian government's desired outcome? I think if I've captured that, at least I think reasonably well, Phil. And then the question in terms of negotiation with the FARC on drugs and resolving that particular issue.
Okay, well, as far as the timing that Mr. Contreras, is it, pointed to, I think, if I understand correctly your question, I think this is an issue more for the post-conflict, because clearly the legislative and judicial side of things will not happen during the course of the negotiation, but rather after. There will have to be, once there is agreement on the various issues that are on the table, there will be items that need to be implemented. And those items that need to be implemented will be just a number of things, I would imagine, that will fall within, if you will, within the scope of authority of Congress. And there, what I think is that, well, certainly the government has a strong majority in Congress, and should be able to, get things done with a robust support from the coalition that is in power now. So as far as the legislative agenda is concerned, it would seem to me that so long there is an agreement between now and, let's say, the end of the year, there should be enough time after that for this Congress to implement many, if not all, of the issues that will derive, if you will, from what has been agreed upon. The judicial side of things will depend, again, on what is agreed. The judiciary will play an important role in implementing victims' rights, for instance. And there is, as you know, the so-called Marco Jurídico para la Paz, which is a constitutional amendment, which will need to, which sets or frames, if you will, what needs to take place in order to implement the peace process eventually. And so clearly there will be a role for the judiciary, and I would imagine that part of the idea, and this is of my own making. I'm not saying anything. This is not government policy. I don't have I'm not reflecting what the government thinks about this. You're asking me a question, and my personal view of things is that as a result of what eventually is agreed upon, there will be certain types of judicial proceedings that will need to take place, more on matters having to do with victims' reparation, land restitution, truth, and so the way I see it is probably there will have to be some form of expedited proceedings designed to implement everything that needs to take place. But again, I'm only speculating. There is really no... first of all, I'm not privy to what is being discussed at the table. I have no idea. Discussions that take place in La Habana are only known by the president himself, his negotiators, and the team that is in charge of this. So, this is, I can't offer much more beyond by what I just told you.
I'm sorry, sir. It's necessary to understand in that way that the concept of transitional justice will take place in the post-conflict?
Well, yes. As I explained to you, we are in the phase of the negotiation. At one point, we hope there will be an agreement. But of course, transitional justice cannot take place between now and reaching an agreement. That's not. It's not something that will happen in parallel. That is all part of the post-conflict, or that will be part of the post-conflict.
I think that actually is a very nice segue into the second question in terms of, from the Colombian government's perspective, this important yet, in the scheme of things, perhaps diminishing issue. I don't know if that's an accurate way to assess it, but I think that's how it was at least expressed in the question. Where that's going to fit in the broader government scheme of development and economic growth and all of these things that are so important to the people of Colombia and the future of Colombia.
Well, look, again, this is my own personal view. But what I think that I would like to point to is the fact that this government has already set the stage, the platform, for what needs to take place in Colombian society. The land restitution and victims law, the agencies that have been created for social inclusion, for spending on social matters, for having a vigorous social agenda, including on matters having to do with human rights and with the protection of people who are at risk. So there are many, many areas where the government has already done a lot of things to set the stage and, if you will, to prepare the platform for changing Colombian society, to make society, Colombia, much more inclusive, to reduce the inequality that has been pervasive in Colombian society for so much time, and again, to deal with the rights of victims. Of course, as former ambassador pointed out, this will present huge challenges among them on the side of financial matters, that is, the resources that will need to be in place for purposes of implementing all this. For instance, the figures that the government has as to what the cost of land restitution and victims' reparation exceeds $25 billion, if I'm not mistaken, perhaps even $30 billion. So, we're conscious of the fact that that many efforts, including economic efforts, will need to be made to be able to implement all the challenges that the post-conflict will pose.
Would you have a quick question just to complete the round, and then I'll ask very quickly for the panelists to have any final thoughts. Would you have any quick questions, Mr. Ambassador, on the drug question in terms of that as part of the negotiation?
That's something that what is being discussed in the negotiation concerning how to dismantle the drug trade. I can't speculate on that. I can only point to the fact that it is one of the items on the agenda. But I can't go beyond that, not because I don't want to, but because I really don't know.
Thank you very much. And so what I think we'll do is we'll start in reverse order then with General Ospina and then come to Ray and Steve, Dr. Spencer, and ask you to make any final comments to the extent you would like to be responsive to any of these three questions, or a final comment perhaps that you wanted to make that you hadn't had a chance to do. Feel free to do so now. And Rich will try to end, pretty close to the time. All right.
I just want to answer to Arturo Contreras. As a professor, I think we disagree in a concept you just mentioned. It's about unrestricted warfare. That concept is not applicable in Colombia. If we take the concept issued by the Chinese, that unrestricted warfare is a Chinese term coined to attack the United States and goes beyond insurgency. And so unrestricted warfare is not an applicable term. If we talk in academic terms, it's not applicable to the situation in Colombia. And I would say that each time the war is going to be more and more restricted because it's turning into a political issue. And if it is political, of course, it will have a lot of constraints. So I would disagree in that regard, and I would say that unrestricted, if we use the Chinese approach, it's not applicable in Colombia. If we just use the word as a word, could be. But in academic terms, it's not applicable.
Simply want to thank the Center for the opportunity to be with such an illustrious group of individuals. I believe that despite discussions of obstacles, that one clearly hopes that peace will prevail in Colombia, that this exercise will be successful. If I take away from this one sort of thing, I think we're kind of looking at I think we really had a good discussion of the political dimensions, and I think we're like turning Clausewitz on his head, and we're talking about turning war back into a conflict by political means. So I think what you're seeing is an effort, and I think this morphing, this strategy that everyone has touched upon is a game to be played, very intriguing, and one we will watch very attentively.
Two things. I think it's always a mistake to underestimate Colombians. And we saw this in 2008 with the spectacular rescue of the hostages. We saw it in the years since then in the successful takedown or the decapitation of the top leadership of the FARC. So to think that there is no glimmer of hope of end of a conflict and then the basis for a durable peace in Colombia, I think is a little bit naive. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize that there are significant challenges and barriers to that happening. At the same time, something that has not been mentioned here but is very important is that Colombia is in the midst of something that a lot of countries do. It's in the midst of a development plan, a national development plan that runs from 2010 to 2014, the length of the Santos presidency. And you can go online and you can look at the plan itself. It comes in 3 volumes. It's very thick, probably around 2,000 pages. But if the plan actually results in developing policies that will begin to bring rural development, infrastructure, land tenure, cadastres, such things as land registries, and begin to develop and look at how resources will be developed in the future, then this is something else that's going to move Colombia further beyond a conflict that involves rural guerrillas, because eventually it'll become a moot point. It'll become irrelevant. So those are a couple of things that I would urge the audience here to contemplate today. Thank you.
So I started the negative spinning of this conversation. So let me redeem myself and end on a positive note. I think there's a great gap between what the FARC intend and what they can achieve. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So what the organization, how they view the negotiations, what they want out of the negotiations, and what they can achieve, I think there's a great gap. I think the FARC don't understand yet, or maybe some of them do, but a significant chunk of them don't, that this really is their best last hope to negotiate a pretty good deal. And that and particularly if the government resists the temptation to give in on the red lines, which have been mentioned by both the ambassador and General Ospina, that the FARC essentially, I wouldn't say threatens, but basically is trending themselves towards irrelevancy, and Steve mentioned that as well. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So if I were to give a prognosis of what's going to happen in Colombia, I am not against the peace process. I don't think it's a useless exercise, because I think there's a historical precedent which was positive in Colombia, and that was the peace process with the M19. People will recall that there was a process between 1983 and 1985 under the Betancourt government which failed, which then resulted in further warfare and an essential military defeat of the FARC, which I think is, M19, which I think is possible, and then a peace process which was quite positive under the Barco government in 1989. And if I were to predict what's going to happen in Colombia, I think that this process will essentially end in failure because of the distances on the approaches. But in the end, we'll set up the foundations for the final peace process, which may take place. I won't predict exactly when, but several years in the future, when FARC finally realizes that they really don't have a future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I have to say I've certainly learned a lot from this panel. I think it's been a comprehensive look at the issues, very timely, very well informed. We left some room for having another panel on some of these issues because we didn't get to some of the topics, but I think clearly there is room for further discussion and certainly observation as the peace process continues. Speaking personally, I'm a little bit more optimistic than perhaps the panel. I fervently admit that that's infused with hope, but not devoid of realism as well. And understanding some of the issues that were raised, no question about it. It's not an easy process, as I had indicated in my opening comments. But I am optimistic for some of the reasons that were said, not the least of which is what Steve Johnson just said. Don't underestimate the Colombian people. And I don't think that in the history of the conflict there has ever been a better moment for peace than what we see now. Does that guarantee peace? No, it doesn't. But in the context of where the country has come from, where the country is going, where the international community has come from, and where the international community is going, it seems to me, as an interested observer, perhaps not as expert on the issues as some of the panelists, but nonetheless an interested and long-time observer of Colombia, it seems to me this is the best opportunity for peace. And to those who are interested in making peace, the time is now to seize it. And so with the goodwill of the parties, hopefully, that can be achieved. And certainly many of us, and I'm sure all of us actually in this room would support that effort as well. Rich, I think this has been a tremendous success. I want to thank you. I want to thank Ken. I want to thank your team for putting this together, letting us be part of your morning, all of your morning. Ladies and gentlemen, one more time, please invite Rich Downey to the podium.
Well, thanks so much, Eric, and I hope you all agree with me that this has been an absolutely fascinating session. Our original intent, and when I say our, I include Eric in that because he was one of the key conspirators when we designed this, and our intent was to present the range of views from the government to the FARC and some optimistic elements, some pessimistic obstacles, their problems, and strategic kinds of implications. And I think we accomplished that objective along with a very energetic discussion with some of you. And I want to thank our panelists. It was just an absolutely superb job. And just a small token of our appreciation, I'd like to give you all a photo of yourselves in action here. In action. So, David and Steve. I also think Eric did an absolutely superb job as moderator. I'd like to present you this of you in action as well. But again, thank you all for being here. I hope you did find this to be interesting. We will have this on the web. This was recorded, as you see, Raul, Nene, and Vivian they're capturing this. But we're going to put this back on our website. So if you want to refer back to this, and hopefully we can actually get something published later on so you can refer back to this. How about, please, would you join me in thanking our technical folks for Raul, Vivian, and Mike Mann for making this all work. But I do want to thank you all for being here. It was really a tremendous session. Would you please join me one more time in thanking our great panel and our wonderful moderator, please? Thank you. Last point is just a public service announcement here and propaganda. On the 22nd of February, we are hosting, as you go outside in the hallway, you'll notice that there is a whole series of flags, and there are pictures of the prócer for each country. And, we are actually, we call that, actually it's both hallways, we call that the Pasillo de los Próceres, the Founders Hallway. And we're going to inaugurate it on the 22nd. We'd love to have you be here. Now, taking advantage of the fact that we have many representatives from embassies here, you will note that there are some larger sort of pictures, framed portraits, and there are sort of 8 by 11 pictures. Since we don't have from some of the embassies the actual sort of painting of that founder, if you in your embassy, if you go out there and you see your flag and you see that 8 by 11 photo, and you said, we can do better than this. We would love to have that framed picture of your prócer so we can honor he or she or them appropriately on the 22nd, but wish you here. So again, thank you all so much. Have a great day. Bye.